Module 12, we're still covering the urinary system. More specifically, we will be talking about the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. Therefore, its main functions is to produce the urine in order to get rid of excess water and toxic waste products. In fact, there are approximately 1 million nephrons in each kidney. And in men, the kidneys produce about 180 liters per day of this fluid that is known as filtrate, and yet only 1 to 2 liters of urine are produced each day. So this means that only 1% of the filtrate manages to leave the nephrons. So what happens to the other 99%? Well, this is what we're about to find out. So let's get started. Like I said, the nephron is going to be the functional unit of the kidney. It will start right over here on this structure that's called the renal corpuscle, and it will end on the distal convoluted tubule. So from this image, we can say that each nephron is going to consist of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule that will be divided into seven different compartments. And we will talk about each of these compartments as we move along. But right over here, we have the three main compartments. The first one is the proximal convoluted tubule, which is the one that's closer to the renal corpuscle. Then we have the loop of Henle, which, like the name says, is going to be this loop. And it can also be called the nephron loop. And then it will end at the distal convoluted tubule. Let's get started first discussing the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is going to be approximately 200 micrometers in diameter. It will contain this capillary network that's called the glomerulus inside of it, which will consist of about 50 intertwined capillaries. Now, blood will arrive at the glomerulus by way of the afferent arteriole with an A and departs in an efferent arteriole with an E. So afferent arrives, efferent exits. Now, where is this blood coming from? Well, initially it enters by way of the renal artery that enters the kidney through the hilum, remember? Then it passes through these collections of arteries. The first one is the segmental artery, which, like the name suggests, will segment further into the interlobar arteries, which also, like the name suggests, will pass in between the renal columns, which is what separates the renal lobes. Then it heads up and curves around the renal pyramid, forming an arch, becoming the arcuate arteries. These will form several branches going up the renal cortex, which again, like the name suggests, will be called the cortical radiate arteries. And these are the ones that will then give rise to the millions of afferent arterioles that will take the blood to be filtered by the glomerulus that is present in the renal corpuscle. Now, the capsule that forms the renal corpuscle is what we call the glomerular capsule, or it can also be called the Bowman's capsule. So both are acceptable terms. But both of them combined, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, forms the renal corpuscle. But on the models, when we tag these structures over here, then we are talking about the renal corpuscles. If we're tagging this specific structure, then it can be either the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. And inside, we're going to find the glomerulus, which we can see also on this other model. Like I said, the glomerulus is going to be this network of blood vessels that are formed by these specialized endothelial cells that are called podocytes. Podo means feet, and of course, cyte means cells, right? And notice how these endothelial cells, they have these little extensions that resemble feet-like structures. And this is why they're called podocytes. In addition, they are considered fenestrated capillaries, which means that they are full of holes that provide nearly no resistance to fluid flow, but are able to retain all of the blood cells, the platelets, and the proteins. And the filtration will occur as the blood pressure forces fluid and dissolved solutes out of the capillaries and into this capsular space right over here. And this resulting filtrate is going to be very similar to plasma with the blood proteins removed. So this protein-free solution is known as the glomerular filtrate, or simply a filtrate. And like I mentioned in the first slide, the kidneys, they will produce about 180 liters per day of this filtrate. So we already know that this filtrate does not have red blood cells, it does not have platelets, it does not have protein, but it will have metabolic wastes like creatine and urea. In small amount, these substances, they are okay in the blood, but they are harmful in large doses, and this is why the body gets rid of significant amount through the kidneys. Now, the filtrate will also contain organic compounds such as glucose, free fatty acids, amino acids, and vitamins. Next, we have the proximal convoluted tubule, which is the next tube, which will reabsorb these potentially useful materials before they leave our body, and we will see why this is the case on the next slide. So the proximal convoluted tubule is going to be the first part of the renal tubule. Proximal because it is going to be close to the renal corpuscle. Convoluted because it is wiggly, twisted. And tubule means that it's going to be a small tube. Notice how this tubule is going to be lined by a simple cuboidal epithelium, right? Is it not made up of one cell layer? And aren't these cells square? Therefore, simple cuboidal. However, they do have something else on their apical surface. And what is it? They have these projections that are called microvilli. And the function of these microvilli are to increase the surface area to increase reabsorption. And the greater the surface area, the more the cell can reabsorb. Makes sense, right? Therefore, the primary function of the proximal convoluted tubule is reabsorption. In fact, the proximal convoluted tubule is the only portion of the nephron that presents microvilli. Therefore, this is where most of the reabsorption will occur. Its cells actively reabsorb organic nutrients, ions, and plasma proteins, if any, from the filtrate that might escape. In addition, as the tubular fluid passes through the tubule, the epithelial cells will reabsorb 60% of the sodium ions, which is positive, and therefore chloride ions, which are negative, will follow as well. And water, which leaves by osmosis. So if sodium goes, chloride goes after, because positive will attract the negative, and water goes through by osmosis. And the tubule also actively reabsorbs potassium, calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, phosphate, and sulfate ions. So it's really busy. As these solutes are reabsorbed, then osmotic forces will pull water across the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule into the surrounding interstitial fluid, which can also be called peritubular fluid. Therefore, outside of the proximal convoluted tubule. And this means that it will stay inside of the body. It will not leave through the nephron and therefore it will not be carried away by the urine to leave the body. And this actually makes sense because remember that I already told you that only 1 to 2% of what gets filtered by the glomerulus actually leaves the body in the form of urine. So most of it gets reabsorbed by the body. In fact, 60% already gets reabsorbed right over here at the proximal convoluted tubule.